So now our application is really taking shape. We have our donut service. We've now understood this idea of application state and also how to get our state, such as below, we're reading the state and we're also reading an individual piece of state. We've now discussed encapsulating that state and moving it out of the components. And if we do this up front, this is then going to help us because we can then move it to any kind of component that we like, and that state will then be fully available to us. It also saves us having to repeat the same logic in various different places. So now that we've got some state, how do we go and add to it? So I want to talk through this idea of a creation operation. And we can achieve this through our form that we have already created. So if we jump into our donut form, we can dive down into the bottom of the template. And at the moment we have our donut as well as our form value. Now we can in fact clean these up, save things out, and we have a more clean version of our form with no logging that might be seen by the user. So what do we want to do now? We want to take our piece of state from our form, pass it up to our parent component, and then inside of our service, we want to take that newly created object and add it to our existing state. So what that will mean is we can create something here, save it. This then gets stored inside of our service. We can then go back to our initial list and it will then be there because we've added it to the state in our memory. Now to achieve this, we need to use our donut single component. For the time being, we're going to use ABCDEF. For the time being, we can use 3 X's to just simply denote an ID that does not exist. When we then save, we get a brand new form, which means that we can go and create a new object. If we then fill out the form, press create, of course this will give us some required issues if we don't actually fill in any fields. But when we do create, we then want to pass this piece of data, our new donut, which is created from our template form, to our service, which is then going to go and add it to our this.donuts. So we've got our, in a sense, selectors, our read all, our read one. So underneath, we're going to create a method called create. Now this we are going to call the payload because this will be sent off to a server at some point, but for now, it's just going to be a donut object that we then go and add to our existing state. So this is quite a nice way to do things, to call things the payload object, because that's the final stage of the object before we want to then commit it to our state in memory or perhaps a database. So what we essentially want to do now is target our this.donuts and then add our payload of the new donut to this array. Now this is simply achieved via an immutable pattern. A mutable pattern would be doing something like this.donuts.push, and then we can push into that new array. And then we can push that new item into the array. However, we don't want to do this because that is mutating the value of this.donuts. So what we want to do is take the existing value of this.donuts and then pass in the new payload object. This then creates an entirely new object, which Angular, as we mentioned at the beginning of this course, remember, we talked about how Angular can use identity checking and see if those two objects are the same. Now, much like an object, two arrays are never the same. So Angular here is going to know that something has changed, which then leads to, when we implement things, a much more efficient re-rendering. So this leads us to a create method, which is now fully immutable. It follows an immutable pattern. However, the reference itself, when we read it, is not immutable. And we'll talk about this as we continue. But first, let's hook up our donut service to pass off our onCreate that's given to us from our form. So when the onCreate fires, you can see here that we have this $event. It's then passed up via this create. And then instead of console logging it, we simply pass it to the service. We can say this.donut service, please go and create me that particular item. So you can see how this is super clean. And this is also diving more into this idea of container components and this separation. You can see this container is a smart container. It contains other components, which are dumb, but it talks to our data layer, our services. It's aware. It's in charge of reading the data. It's in charge of creating the new data. The other components are not. And this is a crucial step in mastering component architecture. So once we have in fact created it, this is then going to pass things to our donut service, adds it to the array, which means that our donuts in memory are then going to have this new item that we create. And this is going to work straight out of the box. The only thing that we do need to do, because we cannot transition back to the root, is to see this new addition, we're going to need to console log this.donuts. So if we save this out, we can jump into our form. Now, at the moment, if we jump into our assets, we have created the vast majority of these. However, we're still missing vanilla sundae and strawberry glaze. So I'm going to choose vanilla sundae. We can then select the icon, We can also set a price. I'm going to set this as new. And for the description, we can say for the vanilla enthusiast. So now if we jump into our inspect, we'll bring up the DevTools console and then we can hit create. So at the moment inside of our service, if we go and count the items, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now in here, we have our donut service with 6 different items. And you can see down at the bottom, we have vanilla sundae, which is our one item without an ID. So that has been fully generated from our form. We have a description, icon name, price, and the promo property. The only thing we're missing is the ID, and that's going to then work when we start to hook this up to our local database and start saving this data directly to our API as if it were a production application. So in this lesson, just to recap before we jump into the next one, we have 5 of our items. We've done our read one. We've then looked at implementing this create method, which then acts as our immutable gateway to updating our state object. We then take that payload given to us from our form, and we simply just pass it into a new array, spread our existing data in, and just add our new one onto the end. After that's complete, we then simply just log things out. Now, when we tie in routing to our application, because we have a single page application, we're not actually going to be refreshing the page, which means that our service is then going to persist when we then navigate between our components because our application is JavaScript driven. So this means that our data, which is stored in memory via our donut service, is then going to persist. So once we've finished creating, we then have this working, which at the moment looks like our page completely freezes. But before we finish this course out, we're going to listen to our API request. We're going to wait for it to come back. We'll then redirect back to our home page component, and we're going to see any new items or items that we edit appear right before us. So that's it for this lesson. By following these immutable patterns, you're going to be well on your way to writing very clean Angular applications. So let's carry on and extend our form to implement the update procedures, deletion procedures, and we'll talk about a few additional things.